Hey everybody, it's Pete. We're going to start before Calder gets here. He's en route, so he'll be here in a moment. But I thought since I have Eric here and we know a lot about intelligence, we might just get started. So our guest is Calder Walton. He wrote a book called Spies, and it really talks about the East-West fight over the intelligence battlefield. And it's funny. So one of the questions that, and we had Philip Ingram on the show yesterday. He also was he was in Bosnia. He was part of the NATO mission. And one of the things that's funny, Eric, is when we deployed as NATO to Bosnia, the Russians were with us, right? And it's a totally different thing. I mean, kind of, right? They were, yeah. He said, this is one thing that Philip said, he's like, somehow the Russians got our op order and purposely tried to deploy ahead of us just to kind of show us they had that. So they had their agents on the inside, even at NATO, which is a known thing. And Calder covers that in his book, but yeah. There's always this competition, even if it's tactical, like they want to do something and it can be like, haha, we've got our agent on the inside. We're willing to burn part of that connection just to get there first, to show you that we have that thing.
Well, you know, we had a defected Spetsnaz lieutenant as one of our linguists in the company, correct?
Yes, I'm aware of that. Which is great.
The day he showed up at my CP, he gave me his name. I don't want to repeat his name here, but as we were talking, obviously he noticed his accent and had questions. He was a specialist, and in the Soviet army, he was a lieutenant that was inserted and lived in around the Munich area, and his job was to cache explosives, so that if the Russians ever decided to invade, if the balloon ever went up, and they decided to invade Western Europe, it was his job to blow certain bridges on the Autobahn and side roads so that NATO had a harder time responding in and around Munich. And so as soon as one of the reasons why we identified him was because several of the agents in the company saw him and recognized him as like, I know his handler. I know the guy who brought him in. He's a friend of mine or whatever. And so
right.
As we spoke more and more with him, he, I asked him, it's like, how long have you been in country? And he goes, this is actually my 6th tour. First with the American army, but I did 5 more with the Soviets.
Yeah. So, isn't that funny?
Yeah.
It's also
unfortunately we had to send him out of country because our command structure outed him to the Russians. And actually, my brigade commander every once in a while he would go on a whirlwind tour of all the agents, and so he'd pack me in the back seat of his Humvee and drive it around. He said, we're stopping by, I want this guy to go as well. I almost said his name.
Yeah.
But he said, he goes, I want him to go. And by the way, while we were driving, he said that we're going to stop by the Russian brigade headquarters.
Yeah.
Said, you just want to show the guy off. And he's like, yes, exactly. And that he did it and he showed him off. And I was told, I said, sir, I am totally against this. And that night at 11:30 to 1 a.m, we were driving him to Tuzla to send him out on his own private aircraft to get him out of country because our command got a call and said the Russian brigade commander knows who he is. He knows he's in country, and his guys know which bunk he's sleeping in on base camp Steel Castle, which was my base camp. And he's still on the rolls of Russian Spetsnaz. So we were getting him out of country within an hour and a half in the dark of night, and I never saw him again.
But I mean, this is the real thing. Like, this is the game, right? And you think, nothing would happen, but you don't know that. And if that commander decided he wanted him back in that time, he absolutely could do it. He could say, I'm going to apply force right here. And you don't even need lethal force. You just need to show up and say, I'm not going to let this go. And then go and move quietly in the night and go grab that dude, snatch him. And then you've got an international incident.
Yeah. Well, and the problem, he was bunking up with the Lurs guys. He was going out with them. I was sending him out with them every day. They were doing the mass grave monitoring. So they were going out surveying all the mass graves from the Civil War.
Right.
And he was going with them as a local translator. And so he was hooking up. There's a bunch of, airborne infantry. These guys would, hey, we're bored. What do you want to do? Well, let's fight. Just that was kind of, let's wrestle, or whatever. So it's like, you're going to send these guys in a bunk where these guys, the guys that were sleeping with them would probably go to town. There'd be a huge fight right within our base camp, and they wouldn't even care what it was about. This is this is a horrible recipe here. So
Yeah. When I lived in the barracks, when I first got there, it was about a week after all of the Rangers and the guys who hadn't been in Ranger school yet thought it would be fun to get drunk and have a bottle fight in the barracks. And so there was still glass everywhere. You got counterintelligence people and then these wild Echo Company people.
Yeah.
It's such a crazy mix.
I served with the company commander for the LURS was Dennis Sullivan at the time. And I served with him in the 1/6 Infantry, just a previous tour, where he was the company commander for an infantry company there. And when his guys got out of the field, they were doing health and welfare inspections. Like, look, you got to get the goat out of the room.
Right.
You've got to. I had the German telecom company showed up and said, we're going to disconnect the phone in that barracks. And I walked out there with him. I was like, what's the problem? He goes, well, let me show you. Well, they got a hold of the signal battalion, and these guys wired in 26 lines into the payphone. So they were all getting free calls, all over for the past couple of weeks. And they had logged in several thousands of dollars worth of calls in one weekend.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of guys you're dealing with, when, that, and you mix those with intel guys, which never caused any problems really.
It's funny. You can tell these stories about the infantry guys, and it's like, oh yeah, I believe that. Oh yeah, goat in that room, yeah, totally, I believe that. Rappelling out of the 3rd story window, yeah, I can believe that.
Right.
But if you and I say, oh yeah, Pete was a spy, he would leave the camp and he would go talk to locals, and they would drink alcohol. And it's like, nah, I don't believe that.
No, well, we were the only. I'm telling you, I was told over and over again that we were the only game in town.
Why is it so unbelievable though? Like, why is it so hard for folks to believe?
It's because this base camp mentality set in. So U.S. forces go into Bosnia and immediately sat on base camps and did relatively, a show of force. So you had artillery battalions there. You had, two brigades of mechanized infantry that were there. And nobody was allowed to leave the base camp because there was really no point. But the intel guys, the public affairs guys, the engineers, there's guys that were leaving base camp. Our LURS guys were leaving. But outside of that, in terms of collection, we were the only game in country.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there's Calder right there. Hey, Calder, welcome to the show.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
We sure can. I got a little frog in my throat.
Listen, I'm sorry for being late. The traffic here in Cambridge, Massachusetts got the better of me. So
listen, I live in Southern California. You don't got to explain to me, man. When traffic hits you, it's like,
yeah. Between the three of us, we know what that's like. Great to meet you, gents.
It's Thanks great. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to look at the camera and say, this is Calder Walton, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
This is Calder Walton, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Hey, so you've got up above me here a CI counterintelligence company commander and a career intelligence guy. He built a data mining company or data mining unit within the U.S. government structure that detected, I should say, the 9/11 cells. Pretty badass. He also was a cold case team guy that figured out who D.B. Cooper was. They cracked the Zodiac killer case. They probably know maybe where Jimmy Hoffa is. They solved the Atlanta child murders, the other murder who's involved. So super high-end intel and investigator. And then this guy right here, 1,000 combat missions, outside the wire intel guy as well. So, and I know you know this, but just putting this all together, it's a really neat opportunity to talk about your book, Spies, and the East-West meshing of these things and how incredible this is, and what a riot it must have been for you to get not only the interviews with these folks, a lot of them who are still alive, but also to dig into the archives that have been revealed. Some of these archives are still not even released yet. It must have just been a dream job to get. How many times did you pinch yourself and say, I can't believe I get to read these words about, whatever it is, the Cuban Missile Crisis, stuff that no one else has ever seen other than the folks who were allowed to see it classified and haven't, they probably lived it, but never went back and read the notes.
Well, it's a dream is one way of putting it, but it's also a huge challenge writing about this because of the volume of material that's being declassified all the time. On the British side, something I know best, actually the releases that come through to the National Archives twice a year or so about British intelligence records. I mean, they are, every time you open a new dossier on somebody that MI5 was monitoring, a target of surveillance, it's, as you just said, I mean, it's, you got to pinch yourself. It's a bit like a kind of a movie or a novel unfolding in front of you. And then the challenge for me, trying to really look at this historically perspective, is to try to bring that all together into a coherent narrative. But my starting point for the book, and I hope it comes through okay, and would love to discuss, is when seen from Russia's perspective and also China, actually the Cold War, as we thought of it in the West, never ended. And actually, the collapse of the Soviet Union, far from being this moment when we all went in the West, job done, actually from the Kremlin's perspective and in Beijing's perspective, that conflict finished the wrong way. And what it seems to me that we're seeing unfold on our screens today in Ukraine and China's posturing is an effort to correct, as they see it, that security outcome in 1991. So it's been, to get back to your original question, it was a dream. It was also a huge challenge, just the volume of material. And then news events, the war in Ukraine suddenly shone a completely new light into what I was reading about Ukraine 100 years ago. So that was pretty difficult. And then there's also just the volume of information now that's available on through open source. So when you said that you've been involved in data mining, I mean, the amount of material that's available now, you don't actually need to go to an archive. It's just so much information is available from publicly available. And that's, of course, changing intelligence communities today. Yeah. So, it's a moving feast. But anyway, that's me for starters. How does that sound for just some discussion points?
One of the things I looked at is, I read through the description of the book, and you're going, how far do you go back as your start point?
Well, my starting point is actually this extraordinary document I found from, and it's about a British intelligence officer meeting with an agent in Ukraine, and they're talking about Russia moving in and destroying Ukraine, and the agent, this is an exiled Ukrainian in Poland, who's begging for help from the Western powers, and is saying, we need help to reconstruct our country. And this was in February 1922, so 100 years exactly before Putin's war. So that's the starting point is the Bolshevik Revolution, when the Bolsheviks seized power. And I basically say that although things sometimes get better, improve between the East and West, actually, like the intelligence war has been continuous, and we in the West have sort of forgotten about it. But from Russia's perspective, they haven't.
And looking at it from the perspective of, you're seeing. I'm assuming that you went into a lot of both the high profile cases as well as the low profile. So you hit the Cambridge spies, and then you hit the Rosenberg trial, and then and there's so many in between, even dealings with Cuba, Anna Montes, and all of that. I actually have a colleague that worked with her at DIA while she was active. But one of the things that struck me was, we keep going back. Anybody that's historically minded, I love reading history, especially. My biggest thing now is the English Civil War and the 30 Years' War. I don't know why that struck a chord with me, but that's my summer. That's been my summer reading and my wargaming list. But did you start to see any patterns and trends of, a particular, anecdotal event, or did you see any patterns and trends that might like point to this is kind of the way things were going as I ended the book. This is the direction where I saw things were going.
Well, great question. One of the things that comes through loud and clear when you're looking at intelligence records, comparing them from Western records, British and US primarily, and then Soviet records, is that time and time again, the great powers, Britain and the US, other European powers, think that things have got better with Russia, the Soviet Union and Russia,
right,
and scale back security operations, or are completely distracted elsewhere. Right. So during the Second World War, the Soviet Union became, as we all know, the Allies in 1941 with Britain and the United States when the Nazi Germany invaded.
Right.
Of course, the Kremlin today likes to airbrush out of history that preceding period when they were actually allies with Nazi Germany. But anyway, so Stalin overnight became allies with the Western powers. And certainly in the UK, there was a mandate in the Foreign Office that said, allies don't spy on allies. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to collect intelligence on the Soviet Union, who are our friends. Well, what did Stalin do? That was pushing it an open door to collect intelligence on his Western powers. And from my perspective, that set up the Cold War as we conventionally know it in the post-war period.
Okay.
It was actually so. What are the themes? And then we saw the same thing in the 1990s again. Scaling back of operations. This is over and done with. And we're looking elsewhere. But of course, Russia's not looking elsewhere. So time and again, there's a short-sighted, immediate priority, and Russia doesn't look at it that way.
No, I mean go ahead, Pete. I'm sorry.
I was going to say a while back, going back a few minutes of conversation about the mass of information. One of the hardest books I ever read is Stephen Dorrell's MI6 book. Yeah. And unless to have the prerequisite work done, it's really hard to understand this book. I mean, look, this 800-page book has this many notes in it. It's got a lot of notes, and there's a lot of that, where Russia focuses on a whole different aspect of the war in the east of Europe. Yeah. And America and England are like, oh crap, we missed this whole aspect of everything, and it's too late, right? And so when you do have to put all this together, you are showing us these partnerships with Tito and all these other aspects, and then we're playing catch up as we were trying to fight this one enemy, and they're also looking ahead, whatever's higher than strategically, they're looking, at a longer range plan that does set up this Cold War. It's fascinating. And then, by the way, many people disagree with how this book is laid out. So you've got to read the contrary opinion on this book to understand all of these things. So not just all of the parts that make this book great and your book great, but also the differing opinions. It really becomes this big, massive things. Now, let me add one more element in too. A lot of this stuff, if you do an agent correctly, if I do my job correctly and I run a source and I develop a source, you never know that they're there. They're the most mundane, insidious thing of all time. And you don't find out for a generation that it was there. So I wanted to set all that up because people don't understand, this is never linear. It's never ABC 1, 2, 3 over. It's this all-encompassing. Whenever I go and I meet a new unit and I'm going to go work with them, I ask the two, no matter how high I am in the echelon, I say, how resolved is your intel picture? How much do you know? And if they say anything more than 50%, I know I'm not talking to a person who has a serious understanding of how complex this environment is. So that I wanted to kind of throw all that at you so you can kind of talk about how you put all this together on your end, because you are taking it's not just disparate parts. It's a basket case of basket cases and then trying to make a sensible story out of it.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of the damage, as you were just talking about, this goes on for years. When you find out that there's been a mole in your ranks, it's not just about the immediate damage assessment done. What information did he or she have access to that we should now be considered compromised? But it's also the collateral damage on the issue of faith, when you have worked with someone so closely and they have betrayed all of your secrets to a foreign hostile power, what does that do for morale? And then, of course, there's just these infamous in the history cases. The Cambridge spy ring that we just mentioned, it was the most protracted and complex counter-espionage investigation in modern British history. It took 30 years to wind up. The first two of the agents, Burgess and McLean, defected in 1951. And it wasn't until the 1980s when MI6 SIS recruited an agent in the KGB, Oleg Gordievsky, that they got confirmation that the missing so-called fifth man was in fact John Cairncross, who, by the way, that they had been already identified 20 years before. But anyway, they didn't know that they'd actually got the network. And as you know, people that know the history, the damage that was done of MI5 and MI6 investigating their own, the so-called Roger Hollis affair, where it was alleged that the head of MI5 was a Soviet plant, a Soviet agent, hugely destructive for the operation of an intelligence service. So it's like you got the initial impact, and then you've got the ripple effects that just go on, as you said, for years, decades, even a generation or so. I don't know if you guys agree with that.
I think one of the most frustrating parts, and I read what the man called Intrepid in the early 90s, and one of the most frustrating part was that there's really no closure to that story at that point, as you described, because he and I'm trying to remember the man's name, the author of the book, but he essentially leaves the service with being unable ever to fulfill his mission of finding that fifth person.
Yeah.
And he left it with speculation. But again, like you said, it's like it's only years and decades later that we were able to uncover that.
Exactly. And then just the thing that doesn't come through in the historical records that you only get from interviewing, and I don't know if you like to speak to that, but your colleague who you said that worked with Anna Montes,
yes.
Like you can't actually kind of, there was one good anecdote or description of the sense of betrayal that I found in MI5 records, where a senior officer in MI5 had basically enjoyed conversations with Anthony Blunt, one of the Cambridge spies in MI5 over a number of years. Anthony Blunt was a famous art historian, academic, and this MI5 officer enjoyed art history, so they talked about it. They were friends. They considered, and basically the memoir, where he says you can't describe it until you've been through it, where your good friend, somebody that you shared your secrets with, was actually a spy, betraying everything that you talk to him about or her about. Difficult to sort of, unless you've been through it or know people, you can't kind of like describe that from a purely historian's perspective. So I'd love to hear any thoughts you have about that. Well,
and that's part of it. I did some consulting with an agency. I won't mention its name, but its initials are FBI, years and years ago, and it was in the tail. It was after the tail of the Robert Hansen case,
right?
Where we were looking at. It was mostly looking at a self introspection of patterns that they use within the networks organization, because what they found with Hansen, again, he's in charge of catching himself. In terms of counterintelligence effort within the Bureau. Yeah. But the reason why he was identified was that he wasn't because he was identified because he left tracks on the network or tracks or patterns of his espionage on the network. It's that he left indicators that he was covering up his tracks on the network. And so there was a total, another layer on top of that. And that's why I keep thinking is like we have these great case studies of old, but now we're getting into a new era of economic espionage, and now we're getting into an era where well, quite frankly, where espionage is going to be powered by AI and machine learning, and that's going to be more and more difficult for. We still have to understand these patterns as you talked about. And good Lord, Pete and I were on the very bad end of the peace dividend. The U.S. military called it after the Cold War. They deactivated one of the companies in our battalion in front of us, so we had to actually attend it when they got rid of all the interrogators within the army at operational level, and they rolled up the banner. So it was just a bunch of agents running around. Well, we learned that lesson once we went into Iraq and Abu Ghraib. Because we used, quite frankly, rank amateurs to run that EPW camp, and we paid dearly for it. Just by saying we don't need to spend money on interrogators anymore, we're never gonna need to use them to interrogate.
What happened? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Wow.
So,
one of the things that I'd love both your thoughts on this, is because this is a chapter of history that's so, if you like, close to the present. There's very few records out, and this is mostly coming from interviews. But the extent to which the U.S. government, primarily during the war on terror, retrospectively, can we say devoted too many intelligence and security resources to counterterrorism at the expense of resurgent great powers, Russia and China? Because interviewing old Russia hands in the CIA, they were saying, we can't forget about this, but needs must, for very clear and present danger with terrorism. But in the cold light of day, retrospectively, what were we doing about China and Russia at that exact nexus post 9/11? That kind of like 5-10 year period.
mm-hmm.
It's a really thorny subject. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Well, I have a lot to say about this.
Me too.
Go ahead, Eric. You go first.
Well, my only thing is, and I wrote about this in my own book, about there was a certain period during the Cold War where Americans fell in love with technology.
Yeah.
And I call it like the rise of the machines. And we really started to disregard the human collector, the agent on the ground. And so when 9/11 hit, we found, the military especially, but just our entire intel community, we were completely bereft of native speaking linguists in certain parts of the world. We had no eyes or ears on the ground, no feet on the ground of folks actually talking and with the locals. So and our solution to it was, well, we'll just focus our technology toward that, or we'll build the network up really quick, and then once this unit's rotation is gone, well, then we'll just dismantle it, and then the next unit comes in, and then we'll have to build that up again. And so it was really, that was, to me, was besides taking the eye off the ball from the true threat of the Russians, the Chinese, or even the Iranians. That to me was another underlying problem, which will probably be different than what Pete says.
I look at things from a tactical point of view, because that's the kind of type of player I am. And when I look at the effort that we put into counterterrorism, we focus everything on threat, and so everything becomes a threat. And it's like, every person's a bad person, and we have a tendency to evaluate every person through the lens of that's a bad person, and whether they are or not doesn't really matter. It has become a bad person. Where I made most of my money collecting was in looking less at threat. And here's a rule. This is, I don't know if this will ever make your next book, but the worst way to find out where the bombs are is to go, where are the bombs? Like it's the worst way. And so I would never ask that question. I would go out and find out what was going on in the community and find out, were we winning or not? Is what we're doing working? If we're going to state build or nation build, is there a state or nation to speak of? And then I'd focus on trust. Because I did these things, I would collect rings around entire teams, entire units, because I would meet the people that they couldn't meet, because nobody wants to talk to the guy who's only worried about bombs and guns and themselves. And so I would uncloak my security posture as much as possible. I would shed the big unit stuff as much as possible. I would trust the sheikhs and the imams and all these people, and I would get to these places, and here's the thing I would do is, I would treat their VIPs like VIPs and bring them on our camp, and we wouldn't search them. We would bring them into our chow hall. I would feed them our delicious foods. And these guys would talk on the phone openly in front of me. They would look and go, "You guys have air conditioning and ice cream? Can I take home muffins?" And I would win their favor and their trust because I was genuine with them. If I could train 1,000 people to do that like I did, look out. Look out. But nobody wants to do that, man. Nobody wants to do that. So yes, we over-focused on threat. We never found the people. I worked with unit after unit after unit after unit, and we didn't find the Taliban. We didn't find the Iranians reliably. They would run and hide. They were very hard to find. And so we were looking for needles in a field full of haystacks. And then we would scramble our brains, have total unit amnesia, and come back with a new unit going, "All right, I hear there's needles out here." And it was like just absolute insanity, and it doesn't work. So yes, we over-focused on that stuff. We lost sight of the bigger pictures, and then interagency, CIA, DIA, all the different things. They would look down upon each other and never say, "Hey, we can bring in some talented people." So, like for me, for example, I was with the Army 3 different times, and never once did any agency ever say, "Hey, Pete's a good collector. We'd love to have him." And never once did the Army say, "Hey, Pete, we'd like you to stay a little longer." Never once. And I'm a really good collector. And so, yes, we over-focused on that stuff. We burned through people, used them up, and sent them on their way. And so, yeah, my answer to that question is yes, we over-focused on that, and we didn't ever develop a seasoned field capacity. We just graduated people up and away from the field so that a collector had maybe an 18-month and a year-long deployment, and all of a sudden they were good at what they did in the field, and they never actually did it.
What a searing indictment. I mean, on the issue of technology and sort of rise of the machines, I like that. It does the echoes with Vietnam of like, we're going to analyze this through metrics.
Happened at the same time.
Yeah. Right. You know, we're gonna calculate this. It's a way, and I should say I was born in this country. I love this country. So I can speak, you know, kind of comfortably about it. But we do seem to love in this country. We kind of bring statistics to bear on everything, and there's going to be, you know, be it sports or intel, as you said. There's going to be and actually, so much of life is actually about, to your point earlier, about human agency and about the importance of human attitudes and ideology. And you can't hope to, I mean, that was the whole issue of Vietnam, was reducing it to metrics about body numbers and stuff.
Oof.
Will never get you the underlying issue of a will to fight. And that actually, it seems to me, the same as Ukraine today. You know, we've all been so wonderfully surprised about Ukraine's ability. And you look on paper, statistically, you know, they're not going to do well. But that discounts the absolute determination of grit of people to fight.
This is an uncomfortable thing, but I think it goes exactly what you're talking about. I discovered that it's affect, not effect. And if you can collect the affect that you want, and I'm using affect, this is for the audience, as a response to stimuli in a psychological sense.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, when you count how many of this and how many of that, no, can you get a Afghan dude to walk 2 miles in the snow to request a song from the radio, understand why that was?
Yeah.
And then repeat that. Oh, now I can work with something there, you know, but we don't think that way. We think about, you know, did we paint the government center? Right. And these things don't work. So you're very smart with that analysis. I think that's perfect.
I mean, I heard it was Chatham House rules, so I won't say the name, but a very senior FBI officer, special agent, speak at a think tank in London in 2008, 2009 time. And he talked about eradicating terrorism worldwide. And the audience was like, what? Because obviously with the UK's history of Northern Ireland and terrorism, it's like,
right.
Eradicate, you mean just full stop, do away with it? It's like, okay, I think that's basically sort of saying you're going to get rid of gravity. Like, can't, how, like, you're not going to be able to even remotely, you're not going to be able to do that unless you address the underlying causes.
Right.
So you can't just say, I'm going to get rid of terrorism, because, I mean, that's unfortunately just part of the people will always turn to violence, but you can do it you can to mitigate it, sure. But I just thought that was just spectacular.
Yeah.
It was at that heyday of the war on terror where, and it just from a friendly audience in London, closest possible ally, but people were just like, what is going on?
Yeah.
It was
part of the problem is, and I've seen that, and we've seen this firsthand with how, when we're working and when we were working for on the war on terrors, you're having a war. I mean, I know it's a misnomer when you say we're going to eradicate terrorism, but terrorism is just a tactic.
Exactly.
You may as well say we are going to eradicate guerrilla warfare, or we are going to eradicate hacking.
Exactly.
It's impossible because the next group or whatever, and folks are going to use these weapons. You can't eradicate the sword.
That's exactly. That's the perfect analogy. We're going to eradicate hacking. Well, no, people are going to continue hacking,
right?
As long as they have an incentive, motivation to do so.
Sure.
So, I mean, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
It made me despair, to be honest. But anyway.
So I don't want to go much further without getting into the Cuban Missile Crisis, because you've got some great stuff in there, and we tend to kind of just look at this and go, and then they went tete-a-tete, and it all worked out. Maybe they throw in a down due too, but we miss so much detail and what went into behind the scenes. So please, let's dive in.
Yeah. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is, how can I put it? It's the gift that keeps giving. It's another layer on another layer on another layer. And I have to say, having done research on this, looked at records from both sides, I have come to the firm conclusion that it is absolutely amazing that the world didn't get blown up. I mean, it is, with just a little bit more of a twist of bad luck one way or another, things could have gone so seriously wrong. So, one of the stories that fascinates me is the role of Oleg Penkovsky, who was a CIA MI6 agent, recruited deep inside the GRU, Russian Soviet military intelligence, and his espionage fed, we can now see, directly into assessments during the 13-day Cuban Missile Crisis at the highest level. They were given the reports based on his espionage were given to JFK, and they allowed, and you can see lots of historians have obviously looked at this, and you guys know this, but like one little code name at the top of the reports actually signifies, it's like the tip of this iceberg of this monumental collection capability. And so his code name was Ironbark, and the reports that were given to JFK were stamped Ironbark, which means the reports about Soviet missiles during the crisis, it meant that it was cross-checked against the espionage that the secrets that he smuggled out of the GRU about Soviet missiles. So he even got the field manual for the missiles that they were had operating in Cuba. Pretty bloody useful to know, to be able to cross-check that against the photos from the U-2 spy planes. And then there's another layer, which again, people just haven't, I think, paid close enough attention to, is the role of, and we talked about technical collection earlier, but I'll give technical collection its rightful place in history. The role of SIGINT, NSA, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, really not even mentioned at all. But you know where to look. Here are the records of NSA collection before, during, and after the crisis, and providing some really decisive intelligence. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, as I said, is like, we think we know the story, and then there's just another, like the NSA declassified their an internal history a couple of years ago, and this whole chapter on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's like, oh, had no idea about this, had no idea that code name funnel meant SIGINT going to the executive committee and then on to President Kennedy. We had no idea about that. And then likewise on the other side of the Atlantic, GCHQ records about that. It's that's the thing. So when you asked originally about this, about writing this in this area of history, you think you know something, and then a tranche of new records come out, and you're like, oh. And so it's all about humility, as far as I'm concerned. It's like, this is the first draft of history, and then when new records come along, when other scholars come along, then they can correct what I've written in this book. But this is my effort for right now.
It's amazing, and it's one of the best sections of the entire book. The whole book is fantastic, and let me just put the link up here. Everybody should get this book if you're interested at all in spies and history. It's great, and I always recommend buddy reading. So buy it for you, buy it for a friend, and you're not going to regret it. It is fantastic. So you talked about cross-checking, and a lot of times in the tactical world, you just don't have time. And so you're just like, you know what, this guy's been right in the past. We got to move. Saddam's over there. Let's go. And sometimes you get to, sometimes you don't. Sometimes the person's luring you into a trap. You just don't know. Sometimes you go to hit a house and you got the wrong address. Sometimes you go to hit a house and it's like, this is a bad man with the mustache and sandals. Oh, shit. You know what? Everybody here's a bad man with the mustache. It's so hard to know. I promise, as a guy who's worked in this, I've put up packets together and I've pushed the button to say, go get this guy. And I promise we've killed the wrong person. It is so hard to know. And so when we see these things in the rearview mirror and you're like, yeah, this intelligence was good. Like, you just never, ever, ever know. It's so hard to know. And when you're making a world-saving decision, even if it's ironclad or iron bark, in this case, you just don't know. Like, you're like, yeah, it's like, I'm putting the gun to the world's head. Am I betting on this to be right? Like, that's what you're thinking about. That's what the boss is thinking about. When you decide to kill, the Iranian general, a couple of years back, like, that guy's packet was on the president's desk any number of times. And it's like, am I ready to do this? Is this going to be good? Okay, yes, no, that's what it is. And it's not as simple as people want it to be. And I'm making that point just so people understand, when something's cross-checked, that's just helping the boss make a decision.
Yeah.
I can only imagine some of your interviews that you're talking to folks who are trying to give you the story of just take the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, and they don't know what you know, even though they participated in their one myopic piece, but they're not going to know the full story. And then the next guy's not going to. So you're really looking, and then just because of the way secrecy works, is they're never going to know stuff. I mean, I was teaching a class at DIA after 9/11. We brought in one of the guys who was in Operation Tora Bora, which was getting bin Laden out of the mountains on the border of Pakistan, and he was talking to our class about things that he had done on the ground as a human collector. And he finally said, yeah, and my protection was indispensable by this air crew and this several helicopters that was flying above us. They were firing drops and direct fire. And one of the students raised their hand. Is like, and he said, are you call sign, XYZ? He's like, yeah, I was call sign whatever, PDQ. And they didn't know that they had actually had a friendship and they never met each other until they were in this class. And that's kind of, I'm feeling that you probably ran into that over and over again of, and the way that you were just describing that, I just remembered when Daniel Ellsberg, Pentagon Papers fame, just passed away fairly recently. Yeah.
There was a write-up about, his life and career and what he said to Henry Kissinger when Kissinger became National Security Advisor. Or Secretary of State when he joined government. And Ellsberg said, now is a time when you're going to realize you're going to be given access to top secret code word intelligence, highest grade possible. And you're going to realize that some of the people in government that you have criticized in the past have had access to that. And this intelligence is going to make you look on the world differently.
Yeah.
And they will have had access to this and they would have never spoken about it. And it's that entering into the secret world where suddenly you are given this new perspective on things. And it's so difficult then, because people, if they're doing their jobs right, and the overwhelming majority of people do, they don't speak about that secrecy after leaving government work. So you're quite right. When interviewing people, especially in the recent past, you would start off on this level. They give you the answer to this story. And then if you can produce a document, or if you say, well, what about Operation X? And they're like, okay, I didn't know that you knew that. Now let's have a conversation.
Exactly.
And yeah, so that's where it really starts, because intelligence professionals, I don't need to tell you this, it's people take the oaths very seriously, and quite right. And then when an outsider like me comes on, they don't know, what I know, nor should they. That's incredibly important to keep that safeguarded. But once the kind of the defenses go down, if you like, in an interview, if you can produce a document, or you can say that actually I'm a trusted pair of hands, then the interview can really start.
Pete, you're mute.
It's interesting in the Cuban Missile Crisis too. Again, with these layers that we're talking about, a guy that's been on the show, Naval Academy grad, his name is John McKay. He's one of the dudes. He's a Marine. He's on one of the ships in the Caribbean, and they're just doing racetracks and figure eights, and he's waiting. His job is not to sit there and twiddle his thumbs. His job is to get some badass Marines ready to go kill motherfuckers, you know? And he is on standby, and his job is to be ready to go do it. Yeah. And so while we see this whole thing, we completely, and when he told me this, I was like, it had never, as a combat guy, it had never occurred to me that there were dudes keyed up, ready to go at a moment's notice that have to be on like 8.5 and ready to steam right towards that island and take care of business. And then it's like, never, so much for so much for order, so much for these orders, just calm down, stand down, go on vacation. Those guys are just, oh my God, it's so intense when you think about all of these pieces in motion at that moment.
They were planning a D-Day style operation. I mean, it was literally, that was on that Saturday was the most dangerous moment in probably world history. It was, the crisis was resolved on that Sunday, and they were planning the D-Day strike for the Monday. That was, there's a story. And that's the thing about history. And that's the thing as well, is worth hammering home for you guys, the practitioners, the collectors, that history only records, obviously, this is a trite thing to say, but history only records what did happen, but not all of the alternative futures that would have been lost to history. So with things that just gone a little bit differently, if Khrushchev hadn't replied in time, if he had decided to be more hard-nosed even than he was, would we have ended up in a D-Day style invasion? It seems pretty clear to me that the chiefs of staff were pushing for it, and probably Kennedy would have authorized it as well. Different things would have looked then. So that's, like when historians like myself come along and we're trying to understand about operations or intelligence, or it is to what I try to do is put myself in the shoes of people who were living it at the time, looking forward to all these different scenarios that only one, of course, actually transpired. But so when we criticize, when we say, when there's sort of intelligence failures, it's sort of armchair retrospective analysis of the worst kind, because actually, I mean, here's a big one that I found in the research for my first book. In 1945, Second World War's over. We would think that British intelligence was focusing on the Soviet threat, which was re-emerging. Far from it. MI5, the overwhelming priority at that point was terrorism emanating from the Mandate of Palestine. So this is pre-Israel, and Israeli freedom fighters, terrorists, attacking the British to get the British out of Palestine to create the state of Israel. They called themselves terrorists, by the way. I'm not using that in a disparaging, but these were their operations, the Irgun and the Stern Gang. So from the perspective of MI5, in 1945, the Second World War is ending. What's the major national security threat? Terrorism emanating from Palestine. Definitely not the Soviet Union, which was a distant, and by the way, maybe we can still be friends with the Soviet Union. And you're looking at it in retrospect, you're like, how is that possible? But it's right there in the records. So it essentially lost to history, that chapter, when looking at it that way. So you guys must have lived through similar things of like overwhelming things. And things that issues and subjects and plots and stuff that are still wrapped in history, that have been lost to history, they've been wrapped in secrecy and they've been lost to history. So that's humility on the part of people that write about it. That's the
Eric mentioned this earlier, and we talked about the 165th Battalion was shrinking, right? We had lost our multidisciplinary counterintelligence company, had gone away. They'd sucked that up because we weren't going to need that anymore. Right. And then we were never, ever going to need interrogators again on an active army scale. So they were drawing that down. And then we were never going to need counterintelligence people with long rifles. And so we were going to all have 9mm and be strategic assets.
Yeah.
And so, this was in the middle of happening, and all of a sudden it's like, you're going to go to Bosnia and be the main effort of this NATO push, and it's
or even
crazy.
Fast forward 10 years, 15 years, war in Europe. No, that was so 20th century.
Not very good.
There's not going to be a war in Europe. Come on.
Part of what military intelligence suffers from now and for the past 20 years is intel officers don't seize and hold terrain like combat arms guys do. They don't. They're not responsible for putting violence on the enemy, that kind of thing. And so, but they have to work in the same spaces as these guys. And so, how do you make a name for yourself and as a career, as an intelligence officer? Well, you have to be you have to be the smartest guy in the room, and you have to be the visionary. Yeah. And so there was lots of, I've read paper after paper of different philosophies. How it's like we never want to fight the war of the past. We always want to fight the war of the future. The problem was, it was a lot of times we did trial and error on what we predicted was the future, and that's what I mean by when we got to the level of technology. It's like, what, we don't need human collectors anymore. That's a war of the past. Right. And then all of a sudden, quite frankly, a prehistoric enemy like an Al-Qaeda group, or even any of their subsidiary groups that were operating around the world. It's like, well, wait a minute, we need to get into these guys. They've dropped their comms. They're not using the same communications that the Russians use or the Chinese use or whatever. So we can't tap into that. We don't have anybody that's got boots on the ground. And that's what I mean by, so many visionaries that have come and gone in the world of intelligence. That says, I am the next, Gustav Adolphus. I'm going to re-wicker how things are going to be done in the future. I'm the next, Napoleon of intelligence or whatever. I'm ready for my award and my acolytes because I made this visionary attempt. A lot of what I write about is really not about the way things should be in the future and then try to mold that to my vision. It's more of capturing, this is how things are actually done on the ground today. Yeah. And that's, let's capture the processes and the people and the tools and the data that we actually use today, not some pie in the sky plan that's, you want to write the screenplay for Minority Report, go ahead, but intelligence is way away from that right now.
On that note, where do you rate the value of open source, commercially available intelligence as opposed to?
I would put it in the 85 to 90% of what takes place. I mean, there's and again, it's like I was part of the first data mining operation that was successful in D&D history. So the things that we were doing there, that was a generational leap, and now we're doing.
What year was that? Right? Let me ask you, what kind of year was that when you were doing?
This was 1999, 2000.
Wow.
I mean, so now we've had 9/11. We've readjusted everything toward the counterterrorism threat. the next generational leap is the chatbot GPT and the AI, and really what happens after when we started getting into data mining is the analysts was becoming, it was like, well, we now have all the ability. When we invested in the 60s and 70s and 80s, all these collection assets. Well, the analysts became overwhelmed with the assets. And then they said, well, now we have these tools to be able to collect more of it. And to the analysts is still now even more overwhelmed. And so this may be a turning point. If we can use AI effectively to let the analysts quit wasting their time processing and collecting information and spend more time actually thinking about, and so you start asking questions more of, I need to collect this, this, and this. And now your questions are from an analytical standpoint are, why did the tool do this? Yeah. Why did the AI element say that these were important? So you're changing your focus on how you do it, but at least you're doing more analysis. And we can either do this right or we can do it wrong, and that's yet to play out.
Yeah.
It's funny. Go ahead. No, you do it. You're the guest.
I just from the interviews I've conducted, agree wholeheartedly, and this seems to be, when an analyst is sitting there and a AI software is saying, hey, have you considered this data set over here, which isn't readily apparent to the naked eye.
Right.
And by the way, our adversaries today, particularly China, are very adept at using this technology. Yes. So again, it gets back to this point of catch up, of racing to catch up. Once again, China's got this seamless integration between commerce. I mean, of course, there is really no such thing as a truly independent commercial outfit in China, and security and intelligence. It's just fused.
Right.
So how are we competing on that stage against a fusion of a superpower with its all the components of its society geared towards acquiring as much data as possible?
It has not gotten easier, that's for sure.
It's not gotten easier. I wanted to back up and say one thing too. You had mentioned war in Europe, who would imagine that, right? And yet let's count them. Like we can kind of throw Macedonia in there, but obviously let's say 5 at least distinct little conflicts in Yugoslavia probably could do more than that. There's Chechnya, there's a war there, and it's like on and on and on. Like war is constant in Europe, but we have this belief that it's not there. So there's that. I want to move in, and I hope you have a few more minutes for us. I want to move into Putin, because there's a lot of things that one, and your book is great. You talk about we have this opinion, and you've been talking again and again in the show about this, that Russia is our friend and their ally. And it turns out Putin does not like America. He's not our friend. And also, we look at Russia as being bigger than it really is. Ukraine is trying to be separate. Belarus is this weird thing. Luckily, the Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia have kind of broken away. We kind of get that, although we don't really know those guys very well. We just mentioned Yugoslavia and all of the. We have the Baltics and then the Balkans. They're separate places. They're not really Russia anymore, but we struggle with what is and what isn't Russia. And then we hate anybody who does great business in that region. They're all oligarchs, right? And yet when the command economy transferred over to the modern economy, we sure as heck were glad to go over there and make as much money as we could. And we are going to do the same thing in Ukraine. Yeah. So we absolve ourselves of any kind of guilt there, but we are guilty of that. So I want to talk a little bit about our role with, and look, as a historian, when Putin's like, hey, America promised not to come any closer, and they have. They've also had infantry. But I worked with the 431st Polar Bears. I know that they were in Russia, granted 100 years ago, but when he talks about that, he is not wrong, right? So all of these things go into this conflict. We get mad and say, Russia's unchecked. Well, he's looking at a longer scope. Maybe he's justifying, but he also is talking from a particular point of view. Let's talk about Russia.
So my view is that, as with most big issues in history, it's not one side or the other. And so what we have with Russia right now, with Putin, we have a deeply militarist, dysfunctional society and government, okay, led by a dictator who has, from the 1990s, if not, he schooled in the KGB in the 1990s, who had in the words of one interviewee, a CIA officer who was stationed in Russia at that time, and crossed paths with Putin in the 1990s when he was effectively a nobody, but even then had a visceral hatred for the United States. Mm-hmm. So that's the backstory. And then has the US and NATO done everything possible, knowingly or unknowingly, to make the situation worse? I'd have to say yes. I mean, it is a fair question when Putin asks, why does, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, it's a fair question, why does NATO still exist? NATO was a Cold War institution. The Cold War is supposedly over. What is going on here? So it's like, there is no, it's not those commentators that say it is the reason that we are in this disaster at the moment with Russia and Ukraine is because of NATO. Well, that is overlooking the deeply militarist, warped problems within Russian society and its leader. But at the same time, has NATO expansion fanned the flames of everything that Putin inherently suspects, and his vision is, particularly post 9/11, post Iraq, was the US is unambiguously in the business of regime change. And you read his speeches from early on then, and he's saying they're coming for us as well. And then the color revolutions, it is all feeding into his, paranoia is a sort of pejorative term, but it is, I don't mean it in a pejorative, but his paranoia of the US is really out to get us so he sees it. I mean, we know, don't need to tell you guys this, the great sort of strategic architecture of American foreign policy in the 20th century, containment. Well, what does Putin say that he's doing? And we, of course, today see that we're trying to contain Russia. Putin sees it exactly the other way around, that he's trying to contain the US and NATO. And the problem I experience in this country, perhaps much more so than in other smaller countries in Europe, is we in this country like to have a good guys, bad guys scenario. It's binary. And if there's one thing that my book, I hope, comes across, is to try to empathize with how other people see things, because the world is, I'm afraid, seems to me historically not just about good guys and bad guys, but there are often shades of gray. And we are at a crossroads at the moment, and Ukraine is symptomatic of a much bigger geopolitical crash between liberal democracies and authoritarianism. And I am profoundly worried about how this war in Ukraine is going to transpire, and whatever kind of peace is going to come out of it, in particular, whether Putin will resort to using a tactical nuclear weapon. My own view is every step of his career, when we in the West have said he wouldn't do that, he's done that. And maybe Xi in China can put a break on him doing so. I don't know. But if it's such a perverse situation that the more NATO helps Ukrainians to fight for their independence, the greater the chances that Putin will resort to using a tactical nuke in order to blackmail the international community to back off. It's a profoundly dark outlook, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
So if you got any, I can give you any other cheery news if you want.
Yeah. But it could end up being kind of a situation where he ends up just on his own house arrest in the Kremlin, surrounded by a bunch of tanks, and nothing gets in, nothing gets out, and we just wait him out until he just goes away, you know?
But I've got an even bleaker wrinkle to that is who's likely to succeed him. And I as much as I want to say that there's a
no.
I mean, it's like, look, if we get, his men of force that he surrounds himself in, former, with military, KGB backgrounds, FSB backgrounds.
Yeah.
If we get someone like Nikolai Patrushev,
It's
going to be just the same, and maybe even worse, because he might be, someone like Patrushev might actually be thinking a bit more clearly than Putin.
Yeah.
But they certainly believe in all the same things. So I don't know, unless there's perhaps some way that if Putin is somehow removed, someone like Patrushev comes in, hardliner, cut from the same cloth, everything, but is somehow able to say that was Putin's war, and although I believe in it kind of in an abstract way, we can't do that anymore. But I just don't see that. I'm afraid I just don't see that happening. I think that this is why we need to sort of really prepare for this being a long.
There's also a roll of the dice where Chechnya ends up with a nuclear weapon. It's just, if we goof around and we make Russia too weak to protect its own assets, that is a real thing.
And that was, by the way, that's the extraordinary. You said, right at the beginning of our conversation, you said, what's it like writing about this? And to look at the records that are now open from like 1991, 2, 3 about safeguarding the former Soviet nuclear arsenal and counterproliferation, it is, and this is the irony is just in layers here. So Russia's intelligence and security services said we need to remain strong, and they said this to the West in order to help with counterproliferation. So in all the other former Soviet republics, in come the Western observers, the lawyers, and everything, help to sort of redefine former secret police to be intelligence agencies, constitutional checks and balances. In Russia, the conversation was, we absolutely need to maintain this strength in our security and intelligence establishment to help nuclear missiles not ending up in the hands of Chechens and so on. It's a pretty cogent argument, but how history shows the ironies then of the power of the Russian security intelligence establishment grew and grew and grew in the 1990s, so that it quickly became the same as the KGB. So those documents are just, if we push for complete Russian disintegration, this is in 1991, if Russia disintegrates, what's going to happen to its nukes? And the same conversation we can imagine is happening right now of if Zelensky's, the maximalist Ukrainian war demands to sort of destroy Russia, what will happen to the Russia's nuclear arsenal? That's where history stops, and that's policy making starts. And,
so you see very few paths toward de-escalation of the conflict overall.
I mean, I think that it's not impossible that we end up in a Korea situation, a sort of a frozen conflict, but that will require both sides agreeing to scale back their maximalist demands. And at this point, I'm just not seeing that.
Who's the broker for that deal?
The broker. By the way, if the broker becomes China, bingo for China.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
Peacemaker in Europe, gold mine in terms of propaganda for China.
Sure.
It's crazy.
Yeah. So
And what's the guarantee? Like I'm always suspect of our involvement, the U.S.'s involvement in returning stability to Ukraine, because from my experience is that U.S. is a net destabilizer, and we hate oligarchs. We also hate billionaires. And so if these billionaires are going to create stability in the economic fortune of Ukraine, I think that we're not likely to allow that to happen. We would rather be over involved and teach Ukrainians how to farm. I mean, we can't help ourselves with this stuff.
Yeah.
And no offense to all the people who have great, fantastic degrees in the Ivy League and everything, but I've watched too many people from out there come with no idea and be too smart for their own good and come with policy ideas that when they fail, no harm to them, but harm to the country that we're in, and we just have too recent of a past of doing that. So, then what happens? You have this teetering, wobbly Ukraine, and you have a teetering, wobbly Russia. This is dangerous, Okay, we screwed up Iraq. All right, well, we'll figure that out. You screwed up Afghanistan. Okay, but I don't know that we can screw up Ukraine.
No, I agree. As a Europhile, someone who loves Europe, I'm hoping that Europe can, the EU can finally step up, and maybe this will be the EU's moment to show leadership. Because I'm afraid I'm with you historically that when the US starts trying to fused with its sort of missionary, everyone wants to be like us, and it's like,
right, actually,
oh, and by the way, like American democracy isn't doing so great right now. So we really, and Eric, did you mention that you were interested in the Civil War? Who said that earlier?
It was Eric,
yeah.
It's like, I'm afraid, I think perhaps you're interested in the English Civil War is because you're turning on the news and you're like, well, it seems to me we're getting pretty close to a civil war here.
Yeah.
How this is all going to play out. Two halves of the country, just one half not talking to the other half. I mean, this is all the makings of a really noxious mix going forward. We're in a real crisis here domestically, and so third party countries can be like, I'm not sure if we really want American democracy if that's what it looks like.
I want to change the topic real quick, and not any better good news. It's still going to be pretty horrible, I think. But one of the things I know, and I know Eric and I agree on this, and this is not political, but it will end up in the political realm in terms of like when we look at our targets here. As a counterintelligence agent, someone who's looking to recruit people, when I see an inability of the political system to hold people accountable for protecting classified, whether it's Secretary Clinton, President Trump, people in Congress who have Chinese people on their staff or sleeping with Chinese, when there's no accountability whatsoever, does it even matter? Should we just open it all up and say we're going to be an open information society? Or are we going to let people like Pete, who are adversarial towards the U.S., I'm not adversarial, I'm just saying in this case, if I'm working for any other country, I'm going to look at that and say, I need a few $1,000,000 and look out, give me a couple of years, I'm going to recruit some people. And how can we not assume, given the amount of counterintelligence investigations that are open against China every day, how can we not assume that there are not just loads of agents in Congress? I'm not even talking about all the other stuff. That's just how I see it. And I know you see like how easily it is for these things to slip in. What are your thoughts?
Well, the headline thought is that we don't, at least we know in the public domain, we don't have defectors from China that we know about that can reveal the inner secrets. And so it's a lot of, I hope and I pray that certain US agencies or European agencies or the British or whoever have their work and have got those defectors who are revealing China's intelligence and security secrets. But we certainly haven't got that in the public domain. And so there, in the later Cold War and in the 1990s, there were some remarkable histories of the KGB written. A couple of them by my former doctoral supervisor in Cambridge, Christopher Andrew, which was like the inner workings of the KGB from defectors. We haven't got that with China. So we just don't know. But as I said at the end of my book, is it plausible to think that there are present day Philbys or a new Aldrich Ames working for China in incredibly sensitive positions of power in the West, in the US? Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and this is a chapter that won't be, I mean, just as you said, you look at the FBI investigations, they're opening a China-related espionage investigation every 12 hours.
It's crazy.
It's crazy. So is that, oh, it's always been going on and now the FBI is just looking more? I talk to people in the FBI and it's like, no, there's a sea change going on at the moment. So again, this is something that, this is a draft of history that can't be written right now. But I'm afraid the history of espionage and counter-espionage suggests very carefully, very firmly, I should say, that we will discover that there are Chinese agents in the most sensitive parts of the US government, working either wittingly or unwittingly. You know, chances are they might not even know who they're working for, that they just think this is just a businessman that they're meeting. And again, you know, there's layers of it in terms of espionage and counter-espionage and counterintelligence. But one of the things that we could do is, for example, with crushing costs in this country, everything from college education through to medical bills, don't get me going on that.
Yeah.
Actually, there's a good argument to be made that federal employees, those that have access to the highest level of state secrets, that their salaries should be increased so that actually these crushing costs that come along, that there is not an incentive to look for other ways to make some money, i.e., I'll just go and give a talk at a Chinese-sponsored think tank. Yeah. By the way, this guy that reached out to me over LinkedIn seems really nice, and they're going to pay for me to go to Hong Kong and give a lecture, and I'll get paid whatever. Yeah, that would really help, actually, because I'm going through a messy divorce, or I've got medical bills, or my kids' college education.
Please give my Chinese counterpart a $100,000 problem to solve. Please, that would be great. I mean, can you imagine? Like, it would be career defining to that person. I mean, that would be a bargain. You know,
that's it. So it gets back to our earlier point. We said human nature stayed the same. Technology, so people now are being recruited over LinkedIn and stuff without even face to face. But the actual underlying issue, why people turn to become an agent for a foreign power, and why people turn to espionage, become a spy, that seems to me to remain the same despite the new technology environment.
I've dominated the whole last few minutes here, haven't let Eric talk at all. Let me just see if Eric wants to say anything else. I don't want to take too much more time though. But Eric, anything before we wrap it up?
No, in fact, you guys are now in an area where I really can't talk. So,
so I just need to produce a document and then I'll get you to talk. How about that? Or if I mention a code name, then you'll be like, oh, he does know what he's talking about. Yeah. No, it's like I'll just sort of say that, you know, to answer your original question, it was a challenge writing this. It was the amount of material to wade through, to synthesize it, to bring it into a narrative, was a challenge. And we are, on top of everything, living through this revolution in intelligence and national security through open source. And the next book I write, don't know what it's going to be on, but it's going to be using open source intelligence.
I love it.
So much out there now that is just waiting to be.
Well, that's just great. Everybody should check out. Again, here's the link for the book. Look, just type in the word Spies on Amazon. It's going to come right up. And honestly, it's awesome. It's awesome. You guys had to have loved this conversation. I know I did. Get the book. And as soon as the next one's out, let's do another one. And thank you so much for writing this. We've got to tell more of these stories because they're just so fascinating. Let me run these credits. Stand by. We'll say goodbye to you in a second.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much.